Mr. Speaker. Thank you again. Just to carry on with where I was before, Mr. Speaker, we talked about part one was my reference to what the Liberals are bringing in the front door registry by giving a copy of the Quebec registry data to Quebec. And this is the back door registry, as we've referred to many times. I'm sitting with my colleagues here, largely from Alberta, that know C-71 well. And one of the things that we picked up on right away when we saw a first draft of this bill was that it establishes that backdoor registry in what's called a registrar, and the issue of a reference number is going to be necessary for the transfer of firearms either from a store or from individual to individual. So just going to go over, Mr. Speaker, what the actual, I think what helps people that are watching tonight is just to hear the actual language within the bill. They've heard a lot of promises from the Liberals that they're not going to establish or re-establish a long gun registry. This lays out in clear language that that's exactly what's going to happen. So the reference number, the registrar shall issue, and a registrar, Mr. Speaker, is the head of a registry. That's why they're called a registrar. I'm sure you know that, Mr. Speaker, but just for the record, the registrar shall issue a reference number if he or she is satisfied that a transferee holds and is still eligible to hold a license, authorizing them to acquire and possess non-restricted firearm. So just that alone, Mr. Speaker, establishes that this is a registry, and any firearm, I'll go into the details too, what's going to be required. This is the actual bill. This is, and I think one of the things that disturbs us too as Canadians was the cost of the former registry. That's one of the big reasons we were opposed to it, was the $2 billion somewhat of a fiasco for the amount of money that could have been invested into really policing the border and really dealing with gangs and guns, putting the money where it would really make a difference as opposed to building a bureaucracy. But this is now what the registrar is going to be required to give a number for this transaction to occur. And all that information that's going to be, that exchange of information too will happen, and all that information will be required instead of being on government servers somewhere. It's actually going to be a mandate of this government to mandate the business owners to record this and keep this information. The business must record for the prescribed period, keep the prescribed information that relates to the business's possession and disposal of non-restricted firearms. Again, it's a record of non-restricted firearms interactions and transactions. The business must record for a period of 20 years from the day on which the business transfers a non-restricted firearm, or for a longer period that may be prescribed. So we're talking 20 years or more, Mr. Speaker. Keep the following information in respect to the transfer. Now, this is what's going to be in the, as part of the registry that the Liberals are denying that's there. The reference number is issued by the registrar. The day on which the reference number was issued, the transferee's license number, which pinpoints every one of us. If I'm going to be that licensee, well, it has my name on my license and it's attached to the number, so it picks out and says who this person is, and the firearm's make, model, and type, if any, its serial number, and the business must, unless otherwise directed by the Chief Firearms Officer, transmit, this is the concerning part, Mr. Speaker, too, transmit any records containing the information referred to in paragraph A or B to a prescribed official if it is determined that the business will cease to be a business. So part of, I guess, the concern is where the government tends to go. It tends to creep out. It doesn't tend to pull in and be more efficient. And my concern is that when businesses are going to be required to provide this information to the Chief Firearms Officer and at their request, in this day of real-time information where we have regular monitoring of our Google accounts 24/7, etc., it's going to be easier just to update that information on a real-time basis. And I think that's what most firearms, especially non-restricted firearms owners, are concerned about, is that this thing is supposed to be only something that's solicited based on the needs, I guess, of a particular request of an RCMP official or whatever. Is that this makes that jump to where it becomes this real transmission where the RCMP are monitoring firearms sales on a real-time basis all the time. And I think, again, I think I was just in New Brunswick for a few days last week, Mr. Speaker, and I think one thing that was most alarming to them was it's one thing to say you're not going to establish a registry and then do it. And I think one thing that rural Canadians are concerned about, not just the registry, but ultimately the broken promise that they weren't going to establish one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that this is really good legislation. Based on some of the arguments that I'm continuing to hear from the opposition, you can tell that everything that they continue to bring up, whether it's about a registry or whether it's about terminology that's being used, that they're just red herrings one after another that they're trying to throw out there in hopes that something's eventually going to stick. When the reality of the situation is that nobody believes that this is a registry. And don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. The member from Red Deer Lacombe said that in committee, said that nobody believes that this is a registry. The Conservatives brought forward an amendment to in committee to specifically say to those who would be implementing the law that in no way this will be considered a registry. But yet still that's not good enough, and the Conservatives are continuing to go on their talking points that clearly have been drafted up and given to them in the lobby over there to talk about how this is a registry, because just maybe it'll stick, Mr. Speaker. But the truth of the matter is it's not sticking. So would the member please kindly explain, if he believes that this is a registry, why the member from Red Deer Lacombe doesn't feel the same way, who's a member of the same party as him?
The honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Speaker, I think what it is, once again, is highlighting how Liberals will take a quote and spin it and twist it to make it into their factual argument that it's absolute baloney. And talk about, yeah, absolutely disgraceful, the fact that they would take somebody that's an advocate in the firearms community and twist his statement to somehow be supportive of your legislation, to me is beyond. But we've seen that in this chamber. We've seen members from across the way deny the fact that this is a registry, call what we're saying false, which is absolutely the truth. I've read it out, Mr. Speaker, in this House. I read out the actual verbatim words of the language of this bill that say it's exactly that. It gives a registry, a copy of the registry to Quebec themselves. If it isn't any more blatant than that as a front door registry, I don't know what this member needs to know the truth. I mean, the truth, maybe read the bill. The member across the way that tries to say that we don't know what we're talking about, just read the bill. And read all the language that's in there that reestablishes the registry on multiple fronts. I think the member should try and do that tonight in his spare time.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable member for his speech, and I know he comes from a rural part of Canada, as do I, and I know that in his riding, no doubt, there are probably one or two gun shows that happen in various parts of that community, and these buyers and sellers who come on the weekends to purchase and to look at these firearms are now being challenged. Their law-abiding citizens are being challenged on that day should they decide to hand over or to sell an opera or buy something. And I'm wondering if he might comment on those challenges that he sees that this legislation is going to provide, going to be against these people.
For Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. He brings up part of the bill that I haven't really talked a lot about, Mr. Speaker, is the authorization to transport provisions. That we had some pretty good provisions that we came in 2015 that we made it, once you're qualified as a firearms owner, restricted firearms owner, as I am, it makes a provision so you can take that particular firearm to the range. It makes a provision that you can take it to a repair facility, you can take it to a gun show, and this is all based on qualifications that you are licensed, you are safe to operate that firearm, and safe to transport. That was what we went with our legislation. What the new legislation proposes is that it rescinds all of those provisions for transport that made so much sense to reduce red tape, so wouldn't have to be calling the local firearms, local RCMP just to transport your firearm to get it repaired. It's crazy, and the resources are already, I would say, maxed at the RCMP. The last thing they need to do is be answering the phone, giving authorizations to transport, and that's what we tried to do. And this government, it's sad that they've just added a whole level of bureaucracy and red tape to lawful firearms owners. And I think it's sad when they talk about they're going after guns and gangs. They're going after law-abiding firearms owners. They're not going after guns and gangs. I wish they would.